So, Greece, if you'll pardon the expression, is ancient history, at least as far as our discussion on EU austerity is concerned. Now to the next trouble spots on the continent among members of the Eurozone club. Italy's government says it's going to spend, spend, spend. The European Union says, hang on a minute, that's against the rules. Very good to have your company. This is Roundtable. My name is David Foster. So it may be time to get ready for a monumental collision between the European Union and the world's 8th largest economy. Austerity's wrong, says Italy's populist government. We're having nothing to do with it. Bang.
Italy's budget is challenging its international lenders with increased public spending. The government is trying to move away from the austerity policies of the past. But EU officials are sceptical. Can Italy's economy sustain a change in financial policy? Or will increased spending only burden it further? Austerity was policy across much of Europe during the recession. Ireland, Portugal, Spain and Italy all made drastic spending cuts to secure money from international lenders. But after years of painful reform, Italy wants to shake things up.
Va cambiata radicalmente tutta la prospettiva, va investito massicciamente nei servizi sociali, nei salari per far ripartire l'economia, altrimenti, ripeto, l'unica prospettiva è la catastrofe greca.
Elections this year saw victories for the country's two anti-austerity parties. After 88 days of political crisis, the Five Star Movement and the League formed an anti-establishment government. Now the coalition government is pushing back against measures imposed by its creditors.
Il budget italiano ha 15 miliardi di euro sugli investimenti, aiuterà i giovani e quindi noi non toglieremo un solo euro da questo budget.
Greece was forced to implement drastic austerity policies. The country borrowed a total of $330 billion from the EU, the European Central Bank and the IMF. But its economy is showing signs of a turnaround. Portugal's government experimented with austerity in return for an international bailout of $90 billion. But public unrest displaced the political administration. In 2015, Prime Minister Antonio Costa immediately reversed the measures, increasing public investment, reducing the deficit, slashing unemployment, while at the same time improving economic growth. The EU has rejected Italy's budget plan, but the coalition government is standing firm. Who will win this battle of wills?
A monumental tug of war, perhaps. Let's get talking. Joining us via Skype from Udine in Italy, we have Silvia Pavoni, economics editor at The Banker. Hello to you. From Lisbon, we have Manuel Caldeira Cabral, who was Portugal's last economy minister. We'll talk about austerity in Portugal with him and across the continent as a whole. In the studio with me, Vicky Pryce from the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and Jack Allen, Italy specialist at Capital Economics. Thank you very much indeed. In a previous programme, we went into whether Greece had been saved or whether Greece had been sacrificed. Silvia, let me come to you first of all. Italy says no to austerity. Italy says we're going to spend, spend, spend. We won't remove a single euro from our budget. And the European Union says you can't do that. Where does that leave these two big beasts?
I think the issue is not so much austerity. There is an argument to be had about the dangers of excessive austerity. It is the composition of this budget that is really worrying everyone, from markets to investors even within the country, and even the Industrialist Association in Italy. So that's the key issue. It's not so much spending more, but where this money will go.
Okay, but nevertheless, the European Union says you can't do what you're planning to do, and the Italian government says you're not going to tell us what we're going to do. We're going to do it anyway. So what's going to happen?
That's right. And we've listened to a series of really flip-flopping comments over the past few weeks and months. So positions have moved. We've had initially data about this fiscal deficit that was going to be 2.4% for the next 3 years, and now we're talking about 2.4% in 2019, and then lower figures. We're now also talking and hearing rumors potentially about certain elements of the draft budget being connected to the law and potentially being discussed later. So if there may be some leeway from the Italian government, although obviously that's something that they will never want to admit.
Okay, Jack, two very obstinate and two very big beasts here. What do you think is going to happen next? Are we going to see a collision, or are they going to sort of just get pretty close to each other and back off?
Well, the collision is already happening. So the EU has rejected Italy's draft budget, and it now has 2 weeks to come up with a new plan. I can't see Italy making enough changes to its budget to placate the EU. It's not just the fiscal stimulus. It's the fact that the economic assumptions underlying the budget are far too optimistic. They haven't been approved by Italy's domestic independent forecasting body. And then, as a result of these two things, Italy's debt ratio isn't falling fast enough. So there's far too big a gap between Italy and the EU for Italy to fold at this stage. So I think it seems very likely that if Italy does submit a redrafted budget, the EU will reject it, and ultimately Italy will be put into an excessive deficit procedure.
Yeah, because here we are in a situation where a government that was elected, a populist government, if you like, a coalition government, was elected on the basis that it said, we are going to say no to austerity. We're going to raise two fingers to the European Commission if it tells us that we can't do that. And if it then caves in, it caves, doesn't it? So the government would fall if it doesn't keep up with its promises, and the European Union would see its project badly damaged if it gave in to Italy and said, OK, you can do it this time.
Absolutely. So there is going to be some kind of clash. So as I say, I think the EU will put Italy into an excessive deficit procedure. Now that would put Italy on the path towards possibly being sanctioned by the EU, perhaps at some point next year.
Pay a fine.
Pay a fine. I mean, the size of the fine is very small. It would be a maximum of 0.2% of GDP, so very small. But the EU has never fined a member state before.
It's symbolic.
Exactly. So it would be a very big political gesture. And so that obviously wouldn't play very well with the Italian government. It might not play very well with the Italian population. So it would be in the EU's and Italy's interests to avoid that situation, which is always what the EU has done in the past. They've found fudges to avoid those fines.
Vicky, rather than setting out the economic policy of Italy here, what are the options? What are the nuclear options here? What could possibly go wrong?
Well, the markets are very worried, of course, about Italy, and you've seen already yields going up. So, in other words, the interest that has to be paid on Italian borrowing now has increased quite significantly. I mean, not hugely, not how it was at the height of the Greek crisis, but we're talking about yields maybe, 10-year yields nearing 4%. They're a bit below that at present. So that makes it much harder for Italy to borrow generally. But in reality, Italy needs to do something. Whether the EU likes it or not, I mean, look at the data that has just come out. Growth in the third quarter was 0. And Italy's now, the UK looked like it was actually doing worse than Italy briefly, but now Italy has surpassed it in terms of really slow growth. So there is no doubt that
this is a massive economy. It's the third largest, I think, in Europe. It's the 8th largest in the world. And if the government in charge of this says to effectively its nanny, the European Union, I'm sorry, we don't like the way you're treating us, what happens then?
Oh, the EU is simply going to have to accept it. I mean, as we've just been saying, there have been countries that have moved against what the EU wanted them to do anyway before, Spain and France. And France actually is struggling with its own budget right now. And there were really no fines imposed at all. The problem with Italy is that it has such a large debt that it should be bringing it down. But of course, it's impossible. We're talking about 134% of GDP. But the slower growth is in Italy, the more difficult it is to bring that debt down.
So the debt goes up, actually. It continues to go up.
So you need the growth in some ways.
And you need to spend money to get the growth.
If it's spent properly, just as we've been hearing before.
Manuel, can I ask you a question, not as a former Finance Minister of Portugal regarding your own country at this particular moment, but as somebody who has sat in on meetings with other ministers from the European project. Regarding Italy in this case, what were the concerns?
I think the concerns is about getting a budget that can be balanced and can contribute to the reduction of debt, but at the same time, it creates a better atmosphere for growth. What we have done in Portugal was not to challenge the institutions of the European Union, but just to find a different path that was acceptable, but it was different from the typical austerity measures.
Do you mind if I come to that in just a moment, okay, Manuel? Because I want to ask you about the perception as a member of the European community at the moment. When you sat down as finance ministers, did anybody say, look, it's up to Italy what it does?
I think that the issue here is not just the fine of 0.2% of GDP, which in the Italy case is still a big amount, but it's the fine that they are going to pay on interest rates if they don't get into an agreement with the European Union. That can be a huge amount in terms of financing, and I think the Italian government is going to have to explain that to the Italians, why it doesn't have money to do some programs, and it's having such a fine, such a big amount of money, more and more money spent on interests, and that, of course, puts into question the policy.
Sorry to butt in a little bit, but did anybody question whether this was going to be damaging, what Italy is planning to do? It would be damaging to the European project as a whole?
I think it's damaging, of course, and if we cannot find an agreement between getting a budget that is acceptable and that can bring growth to Italy and can give a better boost into growth in Italy, but at the same time contributes for the reduction of the debt in Italy and contributes to a stability in the markets that allows Italy to keep financing with interests that are acceptable. If we don't find that in the European agreement, I think we are going to have a problem that is not just Italian, but a problem that is European. When we had problems with Greece, we soon find that these problems escalate to a European level. Italy is much bigger than Greece, so the escalation to the European level is obvious and it's immediate. Italy has to find a plan of boosting growth, using finance of enterprises, using reforms, at the same time that it follows a policy that is not an austerity policy, but cannot be a expansionary policy as well.
Silvia, why are so many people in Italy, particularly the young, so very sceptical, about the European project, it appears, and the euro itself? They consider it to be a burden for Italy.
So the thing is that GDP per capita has continued to go down for Italians since pretty much the introduction of the euro, and since the financial crisis of 2007, GDP per capita has decreased by 10%, and it hasn't gone back up yet. So you can see why Italians are not particularly happy, and the political environment, the political parties in government now have been very astute, I guess, in channeling these frustrations against common enemies. Europe has been blamed, the European Union and the euro have been blamed for many of these problems. But the real issue to me, so the real conflict, the nature of the conflict with Brussels is not so much about economics, but it's more about politics. So tones need to be dialed down a bit, and there has to be a more helpful, I guess, tone coming from Rome. I think Brussels is doing already quite a fair bit. Moscovici has suggested that there will be some I guess, leeway, some flexibility in terms of dealing with this draft budget, but we haven't really seen anything strong yet coming out of the government, besides some rumors. So I'm in Italy right now, and I'm hearing all sorts of things being reported, again, as rumors, not official lines. So what this government needs, and it is important not just for Italy, but for Europe as a whole, is to have one clear line within the government and be forthcoming with Europe.
Vicky, Go on. You wanted to say something.
Well, yes. I mean, the real concern is what people, particularly looking at it from the outside, will be thinking about investing in Europe, whether the euro will survive in the future and so on. I think it will. I think there's a huge political agreement on that. But there are also wider political concerns. I mean, Merkel has just stepped down is stepping down as head of her party, and she's not going to be standing again for that. So somebody who's kept Europe going and
there'll be a new head of the European Central Bank.
No, absolutely, that may change. But I mean, there are wider issues too, in the sense that monetary policy is tightening, so fiscal policy has to intervene a little bit. So I think there are some question marks about whether the Growth and Stability Pact, as it has been designed, is the right one. And we're talking about excessive deficit procedures against Italy. What about excessive surplus procedures against Germany? It hasn't really done an awful lot in terms of helping the other countries. So I think it needs to be rethought. And I think what is going on in Italy right now, in France, possibly we'll hear a little bit about Portugal, and of course Greece, I think brings the whole issue closer to some resolution.
Germany, being the biggest economy, is often said to be the biggest beneficiary of the euro, and countries such as Italy with the deficit, not so. I mean, is Germany playing a very selfish game here? Well,
what Germany has benefited from the euro is in relation in particular, let's forget the sort of banking system, what happened with Greece, but the exchange rate. The exchange rate has been affected by the Italian issues. And of course, Germany has benefited hugely from that. So if you look at the differences in competitiveness, if you like, between Germany and the other countries, they have widened through the euro era, if you like, in favour of Germany.
So this isn't a collective project. Germany's quite happy to sit back and say, actually, you know, I'm all right. Jack?
Well,
Jack.
So countries like Italy, Portugal, Spain, in the run-up to the financial crisis, and then as the financial crisis hit, they ran very big current account deficits, very big budget deficits, and ultimately they weren't able to finance those. And so they had to be bailed out. Not Italy, but Greece, Portugal, Spain. They had to be bailed out. And so then the creditors can impose policies on those member states. They can force them to reform. They can force them to cut their budget deficits.
Who's the euro good for then? Germany?
Well, it's good for Germany.
Anybody else?
Well, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, France to a lesser degree.
Yeah, but certainly not a vast majority of the 26, 27.
No, probably not. But so Germany has a very large current account surplus, but there's little that European policymakers can do to force Germany to bring that surplus down. It can force policies on deficit countries that are struggling to finance themselves, but Germany's doing just fine. So that makes it very, very difficult. All of the burden of adjustment falls on the weaker economies.
There's been a little bit of risk sharing that's taking place now. I think all the institutions that are being built up now require actually even Germany to contribute to the sort of finance of other countries. There is now a fund as well for banks that banks are paying, and the Germans are paying in it as well. So there is banking union, which of course we have a single regulator in the form of the European Central Bank. The Central Bank has become a lender of last resort. It's been buying government bonds to ease this issue of high yields for Italy, Spain, and so on. Greece unfortunately hasn't benefited from that at all because it never entered into this. So there is quite a lot developing, which actually is forcing Germany, if you like, reluctantly, to be part of that bailing out, if you want to put in inverted commas, of other countries.
Manuel, at this point, I'm sorry, you've been very patient, so thank you very much indeed for sitting there. Now, to some people, Portugal is the best example of how to play the system, if you like. There were cuts in Portugal, yeah, a form of austerity, and yet it's come out the other side. The economy is doing pretty well. Did you have to do this because you thought it was the right way to go for Portugal, or because you saw what had happened to other people, people in Greece, for example, and people in Italy, when the cuts were so swingeing that living standards suffered?
I agree that the institutions of the European Union now have more weapons to combat possible crisis, and that is an important change. And for Portugal, when we reached the crisis, our problem was that these instruments were not in place. So there were no instruments to help the banks in the stress situation. There was the monetary policy took a long time to act. So we had problems of our own, of course, of indebtedness and deficit. We correct these problems. We had austerity measures, right? What we have changed in the last 3 years was to change from a strong austerity measures kind of policy of cutting wages, of cutting pensions and so on, to a point where we said, no, we are not going to do this. We are going to continue to consolidate our budget, but we are going to leave more room for growth. But we did that in a moderate way. We didn't went from a contractionary policy that was wrong, because it was pro-cycling and was creating strong unemployment and so on, to a very expansionary policy. We went for a moderate policy, but to a focused policy, a policy focused on creating more trust and more confidence in consumers, more confidence on investors, and also of giving, in a very fast way, better financing for investors. And what we had was a growth pushed not by public spending, big increase in public spending, but a growth pushed by private investment with that better conditions for financing.
So if I may summarize, what you did was you said, look, we have to cut back on some of our spending because we're in a position where we cannot afford to do any more spending. But once you realized that that position had been effectively put back correctly, you then started to spend a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more. So it was never one thing nor the other. It was a start of austerity, then eased off and spending took over. That's the sensible approach, you think, for pretty much everybody?
Yes. No, I think what we have done was to stop the idea that we should continue the path of consolidation by cutting wages or cutting pensions, which was cutting much more consumption. So it was dragging the austerity. And what we have done was, by creating better conditions for investment and doing reforms that create better conditions for investment, and by boosting financing for private firms, we managed to have more growth. And with more growth, we have more income entering the state, so more recipes for the state. And we managed to do the consolidation by increasing recipes, by increasing the growth, by using growth in a measure as a measure of consolidation, and not by doing extra wage cuts or extra pension cuts that were dragging the economy down. Because
so it was never a position of extremes. Are other countries in Europe that have found themselves in precarious financial positions looking at Portugal and saying, actually, it doesn't have to be either all austerity or all spend? There is a middle way, and this is the way to do it?
Well, possibly, but I think the comparisons in that regard between Portugal and Italy, I don't think Portugal's a good comparison. So Portugal, in the depth of the Eurozone debt crisis, had a very, very big budget deficit, and it had to impose a lot of austerity to get that down.
Yep.
So it had a big economic boom, big economic crash, and then a lot of austerity. Italy's situation is fundamentally different to that. Italy didn't have a big boom and a big bust. Italy's big problem is slow structural economic growth. So, you can tweak fiscal policy, you can have a small contraction, a small expansion, but the big issue in Italy is that they need structural reforms to boost long-run potential growth.
Such as?
Well, they can make the labour market more flexible. They need to improve...
Because Juncker says they're lazy.
It's not laziness.
But that's what he says, though, isn't it?
Well,
it doesn't help.
That, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. They could liberalise the labour market. They could make the business environment more friendly. They could strengthen the banks. All of these things would help Italy grow in the long run, and that in turn helps to fix the problems with government debt.
Cut taxes and spend.
I completely agree with this vision. I think the different countries have different problems, and I think the main problem of Italy for many years has been slow growth of the economy, and particularly problems of competitiveness. For instance, Portugal, even during the crisis, where we were cutting internal demand, the external demand was increasing. Our exports were having a good performance because we have done and we continue on doing reforms on innovation, reforms on the labor market, reforms on the institutions with the Simplex program.
Manuel, I have to stop you because I want to go back to Italy just for the very end of the programme. And Silvia, we don't have very long. Can problems be avoided with, between Italy and the European Union?
Okay, I think they can. I very much hope so. What is necessary now is the political willingness and the adjustment of tones coming out of Rome Very briefly on the points of improving competitiveness, absolutely. And one of the main issue really with this draft budget is that these measures, according to external but also internal observers within Italy, are not credible. So it's not necessarily true that the citizenship income, this 780 euros given out to struggling Italians every month, would necessarily lead to higher growth. We need investments, careful investments to make sure that both local businesses and foreign investors come to Italy and
okay. You're all optimists as well as economists. Thank you very much indeed. Very good to have you on the programme. I just want to end where we were talking about the fine that may be levied on Italy. An MP, a senator, if you like, or a senator in the ruling party, one of the ruling parties, has said if the European Union fines us, they will get it all in 10-cent coins, and I will drive it myself personally to Brussels in a convoy of trucks. Our cameras will be there, you can be sure of that. You've been watching Roundtable on TRT World. From me, David Foster, from my guests, thank you very much for watching. Hope to have your company next time. Goodbye.